It's not a question of my own physical perceptions or how I look at things. It's a question of how things actually are. The plain and simple fact of the matter is that we are into the third day of tabulation, and I have been consistently leading in the tabulations, and never in the political history of the Republic of the Philippines has a presidential candidate so consistently led in the electoral tabulations for 3 days and yet managed to lose at the final day. So the momentum of events has already been established. A person or any group in this country can hope or aspire to tamper with this momentum only at his own risk, and he will have to be prepared to face the consequences.
You know, a lot of people speculate. They're saying that if that happens, if after 3 days of leading, suddenly events turn against you in the counts that are being done, that you and your followers may initiate mass action, etc. And yet you're saying that the events have taken a momentum of their own.
Hindi naman maaari na sa loob ng siguro itong ating counting ay mga 7 araw, hindi naman maaari na 3 araw na ang nakalipas, pare-pareho pa rin ang resulta, pagkatapos mababago pa sa ultima ora. Masyado nang dudoso iyon. Kaya hindi na sana dapat tangkain pa iyan dahil kung minsan, all the best laid plans of mice and men will go awry and will produce their natural distortions plus the consequences that they visit on the head of the person who has artificially engineered the process. Kaya sana, tanggapin na lang natin ang ating kapalaran at ang binibigay sa atin ng Panginoon. Huwag na sana tayo maghanap pa ng gulo. We should not go out of our way to exacerbate what is already a volatile situation, because the COMELEC is on top of the situation, the Catholic Church through its parish pastoral councils for responsible voting, and the entire citizenry. It would in fact be an insult to the Filipino nation when its will has been so clearly manifested and articulated in the polls if someone should dare, like King Canute, to sit on the shore and order the waves to stop. The tidal wave of reform has already set in. It can no longer be stopped.
Okay, we'll play the same game that some of the other interviewers were playing with Secretary Ramos. I think they asked him about his cabinet. What sort of a cabinet would a Miriam Santiago cabinet be?
I've already said in the campaign period that at least half of my cabinet will be 40 years old and below. It is essential that we must have youth in the incoming cabinet because the sheer physical rigors of work in the executive department demand it. The person must possess not only the necessary physical and mental, possibly emotional fortitude, but he must be willing to be a hands-on administrator. He cannot afford to have a desk job for 6 years. And so at least half of them must be young men and women. The other half, in order to produce the requisite mix of experience and sense of adventure, should be highly successful professionals who have already earned their laurels in their respective fields of endeavor. But in any event, the cabinet must be a balanced mix.
The way I don't know, maybe I might be misreading you, but the way I read it is most of your cabinet members are going to be from the private sector.
Yes,
below 40, and then the ones who are professionals, etc. So most of them would come from the private sector.
And I would not entirely discount the possibility that some of them might even come from the rival political camps who were engaged against me in the last campaign. In other words, I wouldn't be beyond requesting my own political opponents to join me in my administration, possibly through the cabinet or in some other governmental positions.
Secretary Ramos said exactly the same thing. He said that he would offer jobs to those who opposed him. So it sounds like a nice balance now, if you're going to do the same thing. The only problem seems to be that the Constitution, for example, prohibits any one who ran for an elective office to accept a job within 1 year to an appointive capacity. So that would rule out most of the politicians. And are you now looking at a cabinet in which there are going to be very few politicians?
No, I will need at least a few politicians in the cabinet because my expertise in that direction is deficient and they will have to supply it.
Okay, today Senator Neptali Gonzalez was saying, whoever becomes president will have to contend with an LDP-dominated Congress, or at least almost certainly an LDP-dominated Senate. One of the things that, in case you become president, you will have to contend with is probably an opposition Congress, or a Congress not of the same kind of political perception that you have. How are you going to be able to deal with them? Are you going to appoint a liaison for the Senate and a liaison for the House and just treat them at a distance? Or, as you said, a hands-on presidency? Are you going to, bring them into the government to make decisions? Because Congress is supposed to set policy and you're supposed to execute it.
I'm certainly not going to be a Brunhilde in hobnailed boots trampling over the corpses of my political adversaries. No. When I took my Bachelor of Arts degree in the University of the Philippines, I specialized in political science, and in fact, for a considerable period of time, I was a professor of political science. And then, as we all know, I proceeded to law school and finished my law degrees, and thus, for all of my entire professional life, I have always been taught to pay allegiance to the principle that in our tripartite system of government, there are three co-equal branches. Two are political in nature, one is judicial. The two political co-equal branches are the executive and the legislative. Thus, as president, I shall be entirely prepared to treat Congress as a co-equal branch of government, to exhibit a sense of healthy respect for what is for people whom, after all, will be my equals in that government, and I promise that they shall always be fully informed of developments in the executive branch and always fully consulted.
I think, yeah, that matters, because one of the things that, I remember I wrote about considerably during the past several years, is a constant complaint on the part of the House and the Senate leadership that they're never presented with the legislative agenda. In fact, they read in the newspapers that the palace would like this kind of a bill. They don't even send a draft bill to the House for its consideration. Since you are, a professor of constitutional law and was a judge and is a legal luminary in your own light, are you going to create a process whereby legislation can be discussed with Congress first, and probably some kind of a consensus arrived at, rather than just announce in the newspapers and then have a confrontational situation?
Oh yes, definitely. That would be the optimum procedure, and I intend that in this age of information technology, Congress should always be fully informed of the legislative initiatives of the executive branch of government, even only out of what is called in political science interdepartmental committee. Committee meaning courtesy.
Okay, I noticed that, let's go back to the elections for a while. I noticed that a lot of the votes that you've been getting, I understand you won in Zamboanga City, in some areas of Mindanao. The Muslims had a, were supposed to have, anyway, the MNLF was supposed to have signed an agreement with one of the presidential candidates, the details of which nobody really knows about. But traditionally, the Muslims have pushed for the Tripoli agreement, and of course, the ones who, like the presidential candidate who apparently talked with them, has been accused of treason, etc. What sort of an attitude would you take towards this aspiration to have the Tripoli agreement enforced in the face of an autonomous Muslim Mindanao region? What would be your policy in that particular area?
When I was very young, straight out of law school, in my first year, I believe, as a lawyer, I had some participation in the drafting, or at least in the legal evaluation of the Tripoli Agreement. And I believe that it is already out of sync in 1992. Thus, the very least that we should do with respect to this document is to re-examine it, particularly its basis. It is a legitimate aspiration of our Muslim countrymen in Mindanao to desire its implementation at this late date, but it should certainly bear careful scrutiny. We should proceed with all deliberate speed in its implementation, and my own position at this point is that it is in dire need of certain drastic changes.
You're a constitutional law professor. I understand that when the Tripoli agreement was signed by Marcos, or was approved, he put in a provision